Welcome to the Human Rights Café. My name is Jacob Sule. When people's rights are tampered with or denied, it means that my rights and yours are being undermined. Hence, we must educate people about their rights. The Human Rights Café is a collaborative virtual conversation of a Right to Live initiative to equip new generation of leaders to know, promote, and protect citizens' rights and dignity of all persons. The conversation seeks to promote human rights, justice, peace, and strong institutions as provided for by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Our goal is to build a nation where peace and justice shall reign and respect for citizens' rights. If you'd like to know more about the Human Rights Café, please join our conversation on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter via @HRightsCafe. Once again, Jacob Sule. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's chat on the Human Rights Cafe. My name is Jacob Sule, and this is a special edition streaming live from Abuja, Nigeria's capital city. I also have my colleague who is also joining me from the capital city of Nigeria. Hello, Joanna.
Hello, Jacob. Thank you very much for having me today. My name is Joanna Titus, and I'm happy to be hosting this session with you.
Thank you so much, Joanna, and it's a pleasure to also have you join the chat. We're also being joined by one of our very great guests who's joining us from UK. Hello, Professor Noëlle. Thank you for joining us today on this conversation.
Hello, nice to be here.
Thank you, everyone. Viewers at home, Professor Noëlle is a professor in international law at the Bristol Law School of the University of West of England. Prior to her work, she worked as a researcher at the Institute for International Law of Peace and Armed Conflict in Germany. Professor Noëlle has published and edited books as well as written journals, articles in the field of international humanitarian law, international criminal law, human rights law, and mainly on issues relating to women and children during armed conflict. Professor Noëlle has recently published a journal article and several blog posts on the conflict in Ukraine. She holds an LL.M in international human rights law from the University of Nottingham in the UK, and a Ph.D. in law from the University of Essex. Thank you once again for joining us, Professor Noëlle.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Yes, Joanna? Right, I think we're having some network glitch there. Professor, let me quickly ask you this first question. For the purpose of the viewers who are joining us, who might have been wondering what is really the basics of armed conflicts, tell us, can you just give us a brief overview of IHL and what people should understand when it comes to issues of armed conflicts?
Okay, so IHL stands for International Humanitarian Law. Quite a lot of people actually don't use the word IHL. They use the concept of law of armed conflict, laws of war also. International humanitarian law as a definition, as a concept, has been used by the International Committee of the Red Cross. And I have to say that I do prefer the concept of IHL as such, and so that is the one that I will be using here. The idea of IHL is a very, very old one, in fact, because the laws of war have been in existence for a long, long time, for decades, for centuries, in fact, much longer than international human rights law, in fact. So we have quite a lot of, number of laws relating to the conduct of hostilities, the treatment of individuals, civilians, prisoners of wars, and so on. Most of the laws that we have can be divided into what we call the Geneva Law or the Hague Law. The reason for this is because this is related to treaties that were signed in two different cities in Europe. The Hague laws relate to the conduct of hostilities, so who is allowed to fight, how you're allowed to fight, which kind of weapons you can in fact use when you fight. The Geneva rules relate to prisoners of wars, civilian, sick and wounded soldiers also. So it's more the humanitarian side of humanitarian law that you can see in the Geneva law. This division between Geneva and Hague law, what seemed to be quite neat until a certain point of time, was somehow blurred in 1977 when the additional protocols related to international and non-international armed conflicts were being, in fact, established and negotiated. They do contain rules relating to the Hague Law and Geneva Law. So to give you a broad overview of this, of international humanitarian law generally, so first, these rules only apply when there's an armed conflict. And I can go into many more details probably a bit later about what is an armed conflict. But the moment there's an armed conflict, they start to apply. And we do have, in fact, two types of armed conflicts: international armed conflicts and non-international armed conflicts. And depending on the nature of the conflict, completely different sets of rules apply. So it's quite important to first start by knowing what is the nature of a conflict. What does IHL cover? Very simply, the conduct of hostilities, who is or what is a target, how can a target be attacked, what are the considerations that the attacker needs to take into account. So that is very much related to the key principles of distinction, discrimination, and proportionality. And a more recent addition, not that recent when you think about it, would be the protection of the environment that also needs to be taken into account when you conduct hostilities. The other side is relating to the protection of those who are in the hands of the enemy. So you have been captured as a soldier and you are a prisoner of war. In that case, IHL does apply to you, and you are entitled as a prisoner of war to be treated in a certain manner according to the third Geneva Convention. Also, this applies to civilians generally, but more particularly civilians in occupied territory. So it covers quite a wide range of acts that happen during an armed conflict. I think that's pretty much a very basic overview of IHL. So if you want me to develop any other points, more than happy to do so.
All right. Thank you very much, Noëlle. Okay. You mentioned that the law of IHL, International Humanitarian Law, applies during times of war. But then I'd also like to understand, like, just broaden the scope a bit. Does IHL apply to every state party? Does it apply to every state under international law, or are there specific states it's applicable to? So please, just give your thoughts.
So, international humanitarian law is like, I would say, normal international law, which means that its sources are in the treaties and in customary international law, and of course the general principles of law, which are the three primary sources of international law. So if a state has ratified the relevant treaties, then these treaties do apply to the state. All states have ratified the Geneva Conventions, so we have no doubt about the application of the Geneva Conventions to all states. In relation to Additional Protocol 1, the vast majority of the states have ratified them, but some of them have not, notably the US. But Russia has, interestingly though. Additional Protocol 2 is not widely ratified, but in order to almost countenance this, we do have customary international law. And what happened is that a couple of decades ago, the International Committee of the Red Cross launched a meeting, actually a series of meetings with experts in international humanitarian law, in order to discuss what rules were of customary nature. Out of this came the famous study of customary international humanitarian law that is available online, and you can look at it quite easily. And they actually show you that the rules do apply to all states, irrespective of whether they have ratified Additional Protocol 1 or Additional Protocol 2. Also, we do have some debate about some states that have objected to some rules. So the idea of a persistent objector, like we have in international law, some states have, for example, disagreed with the definition of a combatant, or with the fact that you need to protect the environment in a non-international armed conflict also. So there are some disputes about the results of these findings, of this study. That's why it's called a study. It's not law as such, but it is a very good representation of the state of customary international humanitarian law at the moment. So I would say the first thing, if you have a situation in front of you, look at the ratifications by the state, and if the state has not ratified the relevant treaties, then you have to look at the study on customary international humanitarian law. That is very basic, so to say, in terms of international humanitarian law, because we have a number of other treaties that apply in an international or non-international armed conflict relating to weapons. So landmines, for example, are covered in a separate treaty. Same thing with cluster munitions. So the use of certain weapons is regulated in other conventions. So what you have is that the Geneva Convention, the additional protocols, might regulate in a general manner the use of certain weapons, which we called the means of warfare. But some particular weapons are covered in very specific conventions. But we do not have a convention on nuclear weapons, for example. So it's a big pick and choose, unfortunately, for that.
All right, thank you very much, Noëlle. During the course of your discussion, you made mention of hostilities. So I would just like you to clarify for non-law oriented listeners what hostilities imply. What does it mean?
Okay, so hostilities are almost the fighting between two groups. So in international humanitarian law, we know of two types of what we call armed conflict. The word armed conflict has no definition as such. We have a definition for an international armed conflict and for non-international armed conflict. But the concept of armed conflict as such has not been defined. So in an international armed conflict, what we do have is, in fact, a hostilities, fighting between two states. It's quite simple, though we could argue about what is a state. So one of the questions could be, if you say that there's an international armed conflict between, let's say, A and B, are both A and B states, or are these entities that are non-state? Major questions could be asked in relation to the Islamic State, for example, called a state, though not a state. So would they actually be subject to international humanitarian law because there is an international armed conflict? So quite some discussions on this can be had. So Common Article 2 of the Geneva Conventions explained that an international armed conflict is simply a conflict between two states. No debate about this at all. Where there's much more debate is in relation to a non-international armed conflict. So under international humanitarian law, we have two types of non-international armed conflict. You note that we don't say internal armed conflict, we just say non-international armed conflict. And it is because Common Article 3 to the Geneva Convention says, well, refers to armed conflicts not of an international nature, hence this very long non-international armed conflict concept. So Common Article 3 refers to a conflict between, which is not of an international nature, so it could be between the government and an armed group, or between armed groups, in fact, as long as it is within the confines of the territory of a state that is a party to a Geneva Convention. That definition, however, has dramatically changed over time through practice, through customary law, but also through case law. And nowadays, when we look at it, we very much defined the concept of a non-international armed conflict as one that is indeed a conflict between the state and armed groups or between armed groups. But what we require is that these groups be organized and that a certain threshold of violence be reached. So these are two elements that you will not find in the text of Common Article 3, but that is how it has been interpreted. Much later in time, with the Additional Protocol 2 in 1977, which was meant to complement, to provide more depth to Common Article 3, because Common Article 3 is the only article we have in the Geneva Conventions that relate to non-international armed conflict. So we have this Additional Protocol 2 that was there in order to provide further details about how to conduct hostilities in a lawful manner in a non-international armed conflict. Interestingly, they decided to narrow down, in fact, the definition of an armed conflict. So here, the definition is that it's a conflict between the state and a group, so not between groups. That does not apply here. The group has to show that it is organized, it is under responsible command also, that it exercises control over a part of a territory. So that, in fact, it is almost, you could see it almost as an occupier when you look at international armed conflicts, but that is not the word that we need to use here. And also that this armed group is able to carry out sustained and concerted military actions, operations, activities that are deemed military. And also they have to have a capacity to implement the Additional Protocol 2, so have a responsible command, a structure that enables them to do so. So very restrictive application, which means that when you look at applying the Additional Protocol 2, you have to make sure that the conflict you are looking at fits into that definition. The conflict in Syria, for example, did not fit, would have fitted in that definition, but Syria had not ratified the Additional Protocol 2, so that did not apply. But in many other cases, the thresholds, the requirements set out in Additional Protocol 2 are not met. So what you end up with is application of Common Article 3, only, which is ridiculously small. It's very often called the mini Geneva Convention for a good reason. It is tiny. The article in itself is quite long, but if you compare it to the Geneva Convention, it is quite small. But you have...
Thank you so much, Professor. Sorry to butt in. You talked about the threshold for applicability of either the Additional Protocol 1 or Additional Protocol 2. Yes. For those who are watching who do not really understand at what point in armed conflict with the requirements of these two protocols be triggered, can you briefly talk about the threshold? What is the required threshold for the applicability of either the Additional Protocol 1 or Additional Protocol 2 during armed conflict? Briefly.
Okay, so the threshold is only an issue for non-international armed conflict. For an international armed conflict, we don't care how many casualties there are. Technically, a single soldier being shot at, triggers an international armed conflict. In contrast, for a non-international armed conflict, we need a threshold of violence, so a protracted violence. And that is very much determined by the kind of weapons that are being used by both sides. That is also relating to the number of individuals that are fighting, the methods that are being used, and not only the means of weapons, but also the methods that are being used. Very often the question is, how do you distinguish what people tend to call terrorism from a non-international armed conflict? So terrorism would be more sporadic. So these would be attacks at different times in different places, but there is no concerted, sustained military action. And the moment you have this sort of concerted, sustained military action, then you have the beginning of a non-international armed conflict. So in terms of violence, you're looking at is the state using the police or the armed forces? What kind of methods, means are the rebellion, and we call them the rebellion for now, using? And indeed, if they start to use military weapons, then you start to fall more and more into the threshold of a non-international armed conflict. But the threshold is not only about the violence in itself, it's also about the groups being organized. So again, the group has to be highly organized. There should be a command, a certain structure. There should be meetings. There might be a headquarters. There must be a good communication between the different groups. So violence and organization are really the two key points that need to be met in order for conflict to be a non-international armed conflict.
All right, thank you very much, Noëlle. I would like to bring it down to the situation ongoing in Ukraine. I know most of our viewers, they are aware of what's going on in Ukraine and how it has affected several civilians and their means of livelihood. So we want to know, could you please talk about the laws that seek to protect civilians in situations like this? How does IHL apply during times when civilian properties and the lives are in danger? Thank you.
Okay, lots of things to cover here, so I'll try to keep it short. So first, it's about the conduct of hostilities. Very, very, very simple. In the conduct of hostilities, there's a very simple rule. The first simple rule, principle of distinction. So in carrying out a military operations, all parties, and that is whether they are an armed group or a state, and in terms of Ukraine, we do have, in fact, two states, so it's an international armed conflict. The principle of distinction means that you distinguish between a combatant and a civilian in terms of persons, and between a military objective and a civilian object. So very different words we are using. It's either or. There is no third category. As simple as that. So the first thing you need to do as a commander is, and you're targeting a particular area, is to find out, is that a military objective? Are these combatants? If indeed the building you're targeting is a military objective, then you can in fact launch the attack. So principle of discrimination applies here. If the building is essentially used for military operations, in that case, yes, it is a military objective. The definition is quite complicated, so I'm not going to go into the details, but there is a rule that certain buildings are per se as such civilians, residential areas, churches, and so on and so forth. So if an attack is carried out against a residential area, you have to go on the basis that this is not a military objective. But again, if this area has been emptied, so there are no civilians around, and the combatants from the other side have decided to use this as sleeping quarters, or they actually use it from a place to launch the attack from that place, then it becomes a legitimate military objective. So the civilians are protected in that way. Principle of distinction, principle of discrimination. And the other way they are protected is through the principle of proportionality. So imagine you are targeting a residential area and there are civilians there. But at the same time, there is a garrison of combatants there. Very simple. They are sleeping there, they have ammunition, and attacking that particular garrison would mean that you gain, as the attacker, a military advantage. That's one of the things that you need to show, a military advantage. The next question is, because it's a military objective, can I actually hit it in such a way that there is not a disproportionate amount of casualties, of civilian casualties, or of damage to civilian property. And that's when the principle of proportionality comes in. So first thing, do not target civilians. Second, even if you don't target them, think about the impact, the effect, the consequences of the attack on the civilians and the civilian property. So that is how they are, in fact, protected.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor. You talked a lot about these basic principle of distinction and every other principle regulating IHL. But then I want to go straightly into the issue happening, the war ongoing in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia. We have seen military objectives kill civilians recklessly. We have seen buildings that have been targeted. We have seen children being killed. And this will also take me to your recently published article. There are several school of thought saying, yes, Putin is committing genocide. You recently wrote an article touching on whether or not genocide is being committed in Ukraine. What is your thought on this? By the provisions of the IHL laws, can we for sure say that yes, the activities ongoing in Ukraine qualifies for genocide, or what do you think is actually happening there? Very quickly, because of our time.
Yeah. So in terms of genocide, this is unrelated to international humanitarian law. And the problem we have with defining or ascertaining whether there is a genocide is that very often genocide happens during an armed conflict. So when civilians are being targeted, like we can see in Ukraine, the question is, are they targeted because it's an armed conflict and the other side just doesn't care about the principle of distinction and discrimination, proportionality at all? Or is it because they are targeted because they are Ukrainians and because a genocide is being carried out? So there is always this very difficult, how to say this? It's very difficult in armed conflict to know actually why they have been targeted and whether there is indeed a genocide. So scholars seems to sort of fall into three groups: those who think that there is a genocide, those who think that there is none, and those who say, well, let's wait and see what is happening. I'm more into the wait and see category. And the reason is very simple, is the definition of a genocide is that there must be an act that falls within one of the five categories of the acts listed in the the Genocide Convention, and that that is easily fulfilled. That could be killing members of a group, torturing, deportation, and so on and so forth. So that is easily fulfilled. Unfortunately, I'm saying easily. As a lawyer, you tick the box, but these are the lives of the people. So bit different from that perspective. The second element that you need to prove when you're looking at a genocide is that it must be directed at a specific group. So we could argue that Ukrainians are a specific ethnic or a specific national group. I'm not a specialist in Ukrainian culture, language, and so on and so forth. My gut feeling would be that indeed they are a separate, different group from the Russians. But again, I would prefer the experts to be looking at this into more detail, social scientists who are specialists in that field. The third element you need to show, and that is where I think we're not able to say that there's a genocide at the moment, is that we must prove that there is a dolus specialis. Sorry for the Latin, but the dolus specialis means that there's a special intent. There's a special intent to kill, to destroy the group as such. In other words, as a person carrying out the attack, you want to destroy the entire group, none of them to be left. You're targeting them because they are Ukrainians. And it's very difficult to show this, the special intent. A very quick fix would be that you have a document, a policy document, that very simply says, kill all Ukrainians. I mean, that is something that we did see in the Holocaust, in the Second World War, when, the Jews, there was a policy to kill the Jews. So that was a clear genocide. But as you can guess and can imagine, states know that it's not a good idea to put on paper your policy of destroying a particular group. So we have to infer from the acts, from what is happening, whether there is indeed genocide. And inference come from the way cities are being targeted or encircled. Interesting discussion on siege, for example. I'm mentioning siege because we did talk about Mariupol quite a lot. So Mariupol, some people were saying the siege of Mariupol is a proof that they want to get rid of Ukrainians, but you could also see this as a way to get the population to flee, to get out of Mariupol. That the intent was not to kill everyone in Mariupol, but just to get Mariupol, to occupy Mariupol as a city. And we have to remember something, which is that the International Court of Justice, as well as the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, did not think that the acts that were being perpetrated in Bosnia-Herzegovina were in fact genocide. The only situation of a genocide was Srebrenica. So you can actually see how high the threshold is in order to show that there is this special intent to destroy the other group. That's why I say at the moment, I don't see that
Prof.
report.
Okay, Prof. Thank you very much. Speaking on the ICJ, still looking at the Ukrainian situation and all, is there any possible likelihood of implementing sanctions on persons violating this law, looking at what is ongoing in Russia and between Russia and Ukraine?
Can I ask what you mean by sanctions? You mean that we can try them, or financial
Yes, basically.
sanctions? To try them. Okay.
Basically trying them, yes.
Okay. In terms of prosecution, there are loads of possibilities, but most of them are, in fact, not realistic. Possibility number one is national prosecutions. So that would be the Ukrainians judiciary trying individuals, and we have actually seen that they have been trying individuals, soldiers, Russian soldiers, for killing individuals, killing civilians. Some are currently being prosecuted also in absentia because the Ukrainians do not have, in fact, the individual who is being prosecuted. So that is a possibility that works. I'm not sure that it works quite well. I think we have to be very careful about the right to fair trial here. In relation to prosecution in Russia, I don't think that there is any chance to ever see Russian soldiers before a court in Russia being tried for the crimes that they have committed. The second possibility would be to prosecute individuals before the International Criminal Court, and that would, that could go up to Putin. So an investigation has been launched, in fact, by the ICC. It has been referred by 40 or 50, I can't remember exactly the number of member states to the ICC. So the ICC is currently investigating the situation. And, hopefully we will have arrest warrants or charges at least being made. The chances of seeing anyone in the docks in The Hague are quite slim because the ICC only prosecutes individuals when they have been arrested, so when they are physically present in The Hague. And we've seen in the past with Sudan, for example, or Libya, that it is very difficult to get hold of these individuals. And then the other solution that has been suggested by a number of scholars is to have a hybrid court. So that would be a mixture of international and national judges, mixture of national and international law. And that is a solution that was found in relation to the conflict in Sierra Leone that worked fairly well, in my opinion. And that seems to be probably fairer when you look at the right to fair trial, but also in terms of being close to the individuals, close to the Ukrainians, because people want to see justice being done. A trial in The Hague, yes, nice, sweet, but people on the ground wants to see the person being really prosecuted. And when you're far away from the trials, you don't see that. I mean, classic case was Charles Taylor being prosecuted far away from Liberia, and from Sierra Leone, and no one knew. People were asking questions, is he being tried? Yes, he is. Where? The Hague. So as you can see, you can feel, I'm very much in favor of such a hybrid court. I think it's closer to the person who are affected by the conflict. So yes, I would prefer such a court. But the ICC, it's fantastic, but I don't think we'll get anyone there.
Thank you so much, Professor Noëlle. We are fortunately out of time. It's such an interesting conversation, and we do hope to keep this conversation going. And we're looking forward to bringing you again to share your thoughts as we dive deep into the happenings in Ukraine and Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we're out of time. We can take more questions. We've been speaking to Noëlle. Noëlle is a professor of international law, joining us from the UK, and she works at the Bristol Law School of the University of West of England in the United Kingdom. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us, and we really enjoy and really appreciated your thoughts on the chat today. Ladies and gentlemen, we've now come to the end of today's chat. We look forward to hosting another guest next week as we continue to look at issues of human rights around the world. Thank you very much. And your final thoughts on the show, Professor Noëlle.
Well, thank you for inviting me. My thoughts really of the day is that I really hope that the victims in Ukraine will find justice somewhere, whether it is before the ICC or in a hybrid tribunal. What is happening at the moment is we definitely have war crimes. I would even say that we have crimes against humanity. Genocide, as I said before, I don't think yet. And looking at the current patterns, I don't think that we will be able to pinpoint genocide, but definitely war crimes and crimes to humanity. That is definitely happening in Ukraine.
Thank you so much. Yes, Joanna.
Okay, thank you so much for coming to the show today, Prof. We enjoyed every bit of the conversation, and we'll definitely look forward in reading the article you just published about Russia, the armed conflict in Russia, and we do hope that we'll have the link or any way we can access it. We'll really appreciate. Thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you all, everyone, and have a good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you.
Welcome to the Human Rights Café. My name is Jacob Sule. When people's rights are tampered with or denied, it means that my rights and yours are being undermined. Hence, we must educate people about their rights. The Human Rights Café is a collaborative virtual conversation of a Right to Live initiative to equip new generation of leaders to know, promote, and protect citizens' rights and dignity of all persons. The conversation seeks to promote human rights, justice, peace, and strong institutions as provided for by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Our goal is to build a nation where peace and justice shall reign and respect for citizens' rights. If you'd like to know more about the Human Rights Café, please join our conversation on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter via @HRightsCafe. Once again, Jacob Sule. Thank you.